The diner window was still warm when someone noticed he was gone. It was July 1985, in Timber Falls, Oregon, a logging town where everyone knew everyone, where the mill whistle marked time better than any clock, and where a man's word was still worth something. The Douglas firs pressed close against the town limits, tall and silent, their shadows long even at midday. On Main Street, the hardware store sold more chainsaw oil than anything else. The pharmacy doubled as the post office. There were 2 churches, 1 gas station, and a diner called Rosie's that served the same meatloaf special every Thursday. Timber Falls had a population of 473 people. By the end of that summer, it would have one less. His name was Raymond Lowell Tucker. Ray to his friends, Tucker to the logging crew. He was 36 years old, with calloused hands and a quiet smile that made him easy to trust. He wore flannel shirts even in summer, drove a green Ford pickup with a dented tailgate, and always ordered his coffee black. He'd lived in Timber Falls his entire life. His father had worked the mill. His grandfather had cleared the land 2 generations back. The Tuckers were woven into the fabric of the place, their names on the memorial plaques at the volunteer fire department, their graves in the hilltop cemetery, where the oldest headstones tilted like broken teeth. Ray worked as a foreman at Cascade Timber, overseeing the cutting crews in the high country, where the trees grew straight and thick. He was good at his job, careful, the kind of man who checked the rigging twice, and never sent his crew anywhere he wouldn't go himself. He'd been married once, years ago, but his wife had left for Portland and never came back. There were no children. He lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, a modest 1-story, with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged slightly on the left side. On the morning of July 14th, 1985, Ray Tucker woke at 5:30, same as always. He made instant coffee in a chipped mug. He ate 2 pieces of toast with butter. He listened to the local radio station while he pulled on his work boots, steel-toed, scuffed at the heels. The DJ announced it would be another hot day, near 90 degrees, unusual for the Cascade foothills. Ray turned off the radio. He locked his front door. He climbed into his truck and drove the 7 miles to the logging site on County Road 9. The crew was already there. Chainsaws growled in the distance. Diesel engines rumbled. Ray parked near the foreman's trailer, a rusted aluminum box that served as the crew's office. He spoke with the shift supervisor, a man named Dale Pittman, about the day's cut. They reviewed the maps. They talked about equipment. Dale later recalled that Ray seemed normal, focused, maybe a little tired, but that wasn't unusual. Everyone was tired in July. The heat made the work harder. At 11:30, Ray radioed Dale from the upper ridge. He said he was heading down to check on a section that had been flagged the day before, something about unstable ground near a ravine. He said he'd be back before lunch. His voice was calm, steady, unremarkable. Dale acknowledged. The radio crackled and went silent. Ray Tucker was never seen again. At first, no one noticed. Lunch came and went. The crew ate sandwiches in the shade of the equipment trailer, talking about the Mariners game and the price of diesel. Dale assumed Ray had gotten caught up in the inspection, maybe found something that needed fixing. It wasn't unusual for Ray to lose track of time when he was working. He was thorough, detail-oriented. Those were good traits in a foreman. By 2 o'clock, Dale started to wonder. He tried the radio. No response. He tried again. Still nothing. He asked the crew if anyone had seen Tucker. No one had. A ripple of unease passed through the men, subtle and instinctive, the way animals sense a coming storm. Dale drove up to the ridge in his truck, bouncing over the rutted logging roads, dust billowing behind him. He found the area Ray had mentioned. The ground was soft near the ravine, the earth dark and wet despite the heat. There were boot prints in the mud. Ray's, most likely. They led toward the edge, where the land dropped away into a steep gully, choked with ferns and deadfall. Dale called out. His voice echoed and died. He walked the perimeter, scanning the tree line. Nothing. No sign of Ray. No sign of struggle. Just the boot prints, leading toward the ravine, and then stopping, as if Ray had simply stepped off the edge of the world. Dale radioed for help. By 4 o'clock, the crew had spread out in a search grid, moving through the forest in a slow, methodical line. They called Ray's name until their voices went hoarse. They checked the ravine, sliding down the muddy slope on their heels, grabbing at saplings to keep from falling. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no tool belt or radio. It was as if Ray Tucker had evaporated into the Douglas firs. At 6:30, someone called the sheriff. Sheriff Ben Harlow arrived just before dusk, his patrol car kicking up gravel as it pulled into the logging site. Harlow was 52, with a lined face and grey haircut military short. He'd been sheriff of Lincoln County for 14 years. He'd dealt with bar fights and domestic disputes, with drunks sleeping it off in the town jail, with teenagers joyriding on back roads. He'd never dealt with a missing person, not like this. Not in Timber Falls, where people didn't just vanish. He took Dale's statement. He examined the boot prints. He looked down into the ravine, hands on his hips, his jaw tight. The light was fading fast. The forest was turning black at the edges. "We'll come back at first light," Harlow said. "Get more men, dogs, if we can." Dale nodded. He looked pale. "You think he fell?" Harlow didn't answer right away. He crouched near the edge, studying the ground. The boot prints were clear, deliberate. They didn't show the frantic scramble of someone losing their balance. They just stopped. "I don't know," Harlow said finally. "But we'll find him." That night, word spread through Timber Falls like smoke through a forest. Ray Tucker was missing. Ray, who everyone knew. Ray, who'd been part of the town forever. People gathered at Rosie's diner, drinking coffee that had gone bitter from sitting too long on the burner. They spoke in low voices, trading theories and fears. Maybe he'd fallen and hit his head. Maybe he'd wandered off, disoriented. Maybe he'd had a heart attack in the heat. It happened. Men dropped dead all the time in the logging camps. The work was hard, the conditions brutal. But no one said what they were really thinking. No one wanted to be the first to suggest that something worse had happened. That Ray Tucker hadn't just fallen. That maybe he'd been taken. Or worse, that maybe he'd walked into those trees and decided not to come back. At Ray's house, the porch light burned through the night. Inside, the dishes from breakfast still sat in the sink. The coffee mug was still on the counter. The bed was made, the corners tucked in tight. Everything was in its place, waiting for someone who would never return. By dawn, the search was underway. Sheriff Harlow brought in deputies from the neighboring county. He called in volunteers from town, loggers, shopkeepers, teachers, anyone who could walk and follow orders. They formed search lines and moved through the forest grid by grid, calling Ray's name into the trees. Bloodhounds arrived from Portland, their handlers guiding them along the trail where Ray's bootprints had been found. The dogs circled and whined, their noses low to the ground, but they couldn't find a scent to follow. It was as if Ray Tucker had left no trace at all. They searched for 3 days. They combed the ravine, the ridges, the hidden gullies where the forest grew thick and the sunlight never reached. They checked abandoned cabins and old hunting shelters. They dragged the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the logging site, the water cold and fast from the mountain snowmelt. They found nothing. No body, no clothing. No sign of struggle or violence. No clue. On the 4th day, they found Ray's truck. It was parked exactly where he'd left it, near the foreman's trailer. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver's side window was rolled halfway down. On the dashboard, neatly folded, was Ray's wallet. Inside were $43, his driver's license, a photo of his ex-wife from years ago, and a receipt from the hardware store dated the day before he disappeared. There was also a small notebook, the kind used for logging records, with neat handwriting documenting equipment, inspections, and cut schedules. The last entry was dated July 14, 1985. The morning of his disappearance, there was no note, no explanation, no goodbye. Sheriff Harlow stood beside the truck for a long time, staring at the wallet on the dashboard. The sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the green paint of the fall. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed. The sound echoed and faded. "He didn't run off," Harlow said quietly. "If he ran off, he'd have taken his wallet." Dale Pittman stood nearby, his face drawn. "Then where is he?" Harlow didn't answer. He couldn't, because the truth was, he had no idea. Ray Tucker had walked into the Oregon forest on a July morning, and the forest had swallowed him whole. The search continued for another week, but the intensity faded. The volunteers went home. The deputies returned to their regular duties. The bloodhounds were loaded into their trucks and driven back to Portland. Sheriff Harlow kept the case open, but there was nothing to investigate. No leads, no witnesses, no crime scene. Just an empty space where Ray Tucker used to be. In Timber Falls, life went on. The mill whistle blew. The diner served meatloaf on Thursdays, but something had changed. People locked their doors at night now. They looked over their shoulders when they walked alone, and when they passed Ray Tucker's house, with its sagging porch and peeling paint, they crossed to the other side of the street. Because, in a town of 473 people, where everyone knew everyone, a man had vanished without a trace. And if it could happen to Ray Tucker, it could happen to anyone. The forest kept its secrets. The trees stood silent and tall, their shadows stretching across the town like fingers. And somewhere in the dark spaces between the Douglas firs, the answer waited, patient, hidden, untouched by time or memory. Ray Tucker was gone, but the question of what happened to him remained, growing heavier with each passing day, settling into the bones of Timber Falls like winter cold. How does a man vanish in a place where everyone knows everyone? That was the question that haunted Timber Falls. It echoed in the diner. It whispered in the hardware store. It followed people home and sat beside them in the dark. And no one had an answer. Summer turned to fall, and the forest changed colors. The Douglas firs remained green, eternal, but the aspens and maples burned gold and crimson before releasing their leaves to the wind. The logging crews worked through September, their chainsaws singing in the high country, but they no longer worked the ridge where Ray Tucker had disappeared. That section remained untouched, the trees standing undisturbed, as if even the timber company respected the mystery that lived there now. Sheriff Harlow kept Ray's case file on his desk. It sat there like an accusation, growing thicker as weeks passed. He'd interviewed everyone who'd been at the logging site that day. He'd talked to Ray's neighbors, his ex-wife in Portland, the bartender at the Legion Hall where Ray sometimes had a beer on Friday nights. He'd requested Ray's phone records, his bank statements, his medical history. Nothing. No debts, no enemies, no reason to run, no reason to die. The investigation stalled, not because Harlow stopped trying, but because there was nothing left to investigate. Ray Tucker had simply ceased to exist on July 14, 1985, at approximately 11:30 in the morning, somewhere on County Road 9 in the Cascade foothills. Everything before that moment was documented and known. Everything after was silence. By October, the search parties had stopped. The volunteers had gone back to their lives. The bloodhounds had followed other trails in other towns. The forest reclaimed the bootprints, covering them with fallen leaves and new growth. Nature had a way of erasing human presence, of smoothing over disturbances until there was nothing left but the eternal rhythm of the trees. But Timber Falls didn't forget. Ray's house sat empty through the autumn. His ex-wife, Helen, came up from Portland to collect his things. She was 41 now, her dark hair cut short, her face drawn with a sadness that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with waste. She'd left Ray 7 years earlier, tired of the small town and the logging life, tired of watching her husband come home covered in sawdust and exhaustion. She'd wanted more. Portland had given her that, a job at a bank, a small apartment with a view of the river, a life that felt like progress. But standing in Ray's kitchen, surrounded by his dishes and his silence, Helen felt something collapse inside her chest. He was a good man, she told Sheriff Harlow, who'd come by to return Ray's personal effects, the wallet, the watch he'd left on his nightstand, the notebook with its careful handwriting. He deserved better than this. Harlow nodded. He'd heard variations of that sentiment 100 times in the past 3 months. Everyone agreed Ray Tucker deserved better. But deserving and getting were two different things. If you remember anything, Harlow said, anything at all that might help. Helen shook her head. We hadn't spoken in 2 years, not since the divorce was finalized. I don't know what he was doing, who he was seeing. If there was, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. If there was something wrong, if there was danger, if there was a reason. But there wasn't. That was what made it unbearable. Ray Tucker had been ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of man who showed up on time, did his work, and went home. There was no drama in his life, no darkness, no secrets, or so everyone believed. Helen packed Ray's belongings into cardboard boxes, clothes, books, old photographs, and drove them back to Portland. She put them in storage, thinking maybe someday she'd go through them, but she never did. Some boxes were too heavy to open. The house was sold in November. A young couple from Eugene bought it, drawn by the low price and the quiet town. They painted the porch. They replaced the sagging boards. They hung curtains in the windows and planted flowers in the yard. But they didn't stay long. 18 months later, they sold it and moved away. They never said why, but people in Timber Falls whispered that the house felt wrong, that it held something cold in its wall. That, late at night, you could hear footsteps on the porch, even though no one was there. By 1987, Ray Tucker's disappearance had become a local legend, a story told in the diner over coffee, a cautionary tale shared around campfires. The details shifted with each telling. Some said Ray had been running from something. Others said he'd been killed by a drifter passing through town. A few believed he'd staged his own disappearance, that he was living somewhere under a new name, free from the weight of his old life. But most people believed what Sheriff Harlow believed, that Ray Tucker had met with foul play, and that whoever was responsible had hidden the evidence so well it would never be found. Harlow retired in 1989. He'd aged a decade in the 4 years since Ray vanished. The unsolved case had worn him down, grinding away at his certainty that order could be maintained, that truth could be uncovered. On his last day as sheriff, he stood in his office and looked at Ray's file one final time. Then he placed it in a box marked cold cases and carried it down to the basement storage room, where it joined dozens of other files, other mysteries, other failures. The new sheriff was a man named Tom Ridley, younger and more pragmatic. He reviewed Ray Tucker's case as a matter of protocol, but he didn't reopen it. There was nothing to investigate. The trail had gone cold years ago, frozen solid like the snow that fell on the high ridges every winter. Life in Timber Falls continued its slow, predictable rhythm. The mill processed timber. The diner served meatloaf. Children grew up hearing about the man who'd walked into the forest and never came back. They turned it into a game, daring each other to walk up County Road 9 at dusk, to stand near the ravine where Ray's bootprints had been found. Most turned back before they got there. The few who didn't reported feeling watched, though they could never say by what. The years passed. 1990. 1991. 1992. Ray Tucker's name appeared less and less in conversation. New people moved to town. Old-timers died or moved away. The collective memory of Timber Falls began to shift, the sharp edges of Ray's disappearance softening into something vague and distant. But there were still people who remembered. Dale Pittman, the shift supervisor who'd last spoken to Ray on the radio, never went back to the logging site on County Road 9. He requested a transfer to a different section, farther north, where the trees grew denser and the past felt less immediate. He worked there until he retired in 1995, and he never spoke about Ray Tucker unless someone asked. Even then, his answers were short, clipped, as if saying too much might summon something he didn't want to face. When reporters from Portland came to Timber Falls in 1988, doing a piece on unsolved disappearances in Oregon, Dale refused to be interviewed. "It won't bring him back," he told them, "and it won't give you any answer." The reporters went away disappointed, but Dale didn't care. He'd learned something in the years since Ray vanished, that some questions didn't have answers, that some mysteries were meant to stay buried, that the forest kept its secrets, and no amount of searching would change that. By the mid-1990s, Ray Tucker's case had been essentially forgotten by everyone except a handful of people who'd known him personally. His ex-wife, Helen, remarried in 1993, a quiet ceremony in Portland with only a few guests. She never returned to Timber Falls. Sheriff Harlow died in 1996, a heart attack in his sleep, taking with him whatever theories he'd never shared. The logging site on County Road 9 was eventually closed, the timber exhausted, the land left to regrow. And Ray Tucker's house changed hands 3 more times, each owner staying only a year or 2 before selling. By 2000, it had been abandoned entirely, the windows boarded up, the yard overgrown with blackberry bramble. Teenagers sometimes broke in, spray painting graffiti on the wall, leaving beer cans on the warped floor. But they never stayed long. There was something about the place that made people uneasy, a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with dust or decay. The house stood empty, a monument to absence. And in its silence, it held a question that Timber Falls had learned to live with, but never answered. Where was Ray Tucker? The question became part of the town's identity, woven into its history like the names on the memorial plaques and the graves in the hilltop cemetery. It was the thing that made Timber Falls different from every other small logging town in Oregon. It was the shadow that never quite lifted, even on the brightest summer days. In the diner, where the meatloaf special was still served every Thursday, there was a photo on the wall, black and white, slightly faded. It showed the logging crew from 1985. All of them standing in front of a massive Douglas fir they'd just felled. Ray Tucker was in the center, his arms crossed, a slight smile on his face. He looked solid, real, permanent. But he wasn't. Rosie, the diner's owner, kept the photo up even as the years passed and the faces in it became unfamiliar to younger patrons. When people asked about it, she'd tell them the story. About Ray Tucker, who'd vanished without a trace. About the search that found nothing. About the mystery that still haunted the town. And sometimes, late at night, when the diner was empty and Rosie was wiping down the counter, she'd look at that photo and wonder, what had Ray seen in those final moments? What had happened in the space between his radio call and his disappearance? Had he been afraid? Had he known? There were no answers. Only the photo, frozen in time, and the silence that followed. The forest grew back over the logging roads. The ravine filled with ferns and moss. The boot prints were long gone, buried under layers of fallen leaves and new soil. Nature reclaimed what had been disturbed, smoothing over the scars, hiding the evidence. But somewhere in those trees, in the deep places where the sunlight never reached, the truth remained, patient, hidden. 15 years after Ray Tucker disappeared, Timber Falls had changed. The population had shrunk to just under 400. The mill had closed in 1998, the victim of cheaper timber from Canada and shifting markets. Many families had moved away, chasing work in Portland or Eugene or Seattle. The storefronts on Main Street sat empty. The gas station changed owners twice. Only the diner remained constant, serving the same coffee, the same meatloaf, to a dwindling number of customers. The town was dying slowly, the way small towns die, not with violence or drama, but with quiet erosion, one family at a time, one closed business at a time. And in that dying, Ray Tucker's disappearance seemed less like a tragedy and more like a prophecy, as if he'd seen what was coming and simply walked away before it arrived. But that wasn't true. Ray hadn't chosen to leave. Something had happened to him, something final and irreversible. The people who still remembered knew that. They carried the knowledge like a weight, pressing down on their shoulders, making them tired in ways that had nothing to do with age. And they waited, not consciously, not actively, but somewhere deep inside. They waited for the moment when the silence would finally break, when the forest would give up its secret, when the truth would emerge from the dark spaces between the trees. They didn't know how long they'd have to wait. They didn't know it would take another 3 years, but the wait was almost over. In the summer of 2003, 18 years after Ray Tucker walked into the forest and never came back, something would be found. Something that had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. Something that would make people in Timber Falls remember the question they'd learned to stop asking. Where was Ray Tucker? The answer was closer than anyone imagined. Waiting, silent, patient as the trees. The drought came in June. It was 2003, and Oregon had seen one of the driest springs in 50 years. The snowpack in the Cascades melted early, leaving the rivers low and sluggish. Creeks that normally ran fast and cold slowed to a trickle, exposing rocks that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. The forest floor became brittle and brown, the ferns curling at the edges, the moss losing its vivid green. Fire warnings were posted at every trailhead. The air smelled of dust and dried pine needles. In Timber Falls, the reservoir that supplied the town's water had dropped 15 feet below its normal level. The shoreline receded, revealing mudflats and the skeletal remains of trees that had been submerged when the reservoir was first filled in 1967. The water was brown and low, barely covering the old pump house at the center. On July 8, 2003, a local fisherman named Gary Breslin launched his aluminum boat at the public access point. Gary was 63, retired from a life of construction work in Portland, and had moved to Timber Falls 5 years earlier, seeking quiet. He fished the reservoir 3 times a week, usually catching nothing. But that wasn't the point. The point was the silence, the stillness, the way the water reflected the sky like a mirror. That morning Gary motored slowly along the western shore, where the old logging road used to run before the valley was flooded. The water there was especially shallow now, no more than 4 or 5 feet deep. His motor churned up silt from the bottom, leaving a brown trail behind the boat. He was about to turn back when he saw something, a shape in the water, dark, angular, not natural. Gary cut the motor and let the boat drift closer. He leaned over the side, squinting against the glare. The water was murky, but he could make out the outline clearly now. Metal rusted. The corner of something large, half buried in the mud. A vehicle. Gary's first thought was that someone had dumped an old car, maybe decades ago, before the reservoir was filled. People did that back then, used the valley as a junkyard. getting rid of whatever they didn't want before the water came. He'd heard stories about entire barns and farmhouses that had been left behind, now resting on the bottom of the reservoir like submerged ghosts. But something about this felt different. Gary anchored the boat and called the sheriff's office on his cell phone. The signal was weak, crackling with static, but he got through. He described what he'd found. The dispatcher, a woman named Linda Kowalski, told him to stay put. Someone would be there within the hour. Gary waited, his boat rocking gently on the low water. The sun climbed higher, the heat pressed down, and below the surface, barely visible through the brown water, the vehicle waited in silence. Sheriff Tom Ridley arrived at noon, accompanied by Deputy Marcus Chen. Ridley was 54 now, his hair completely grey, his face weathered from too many years of stress and too few moments of rest. He'd been sheriff for 14 years, inheriting the position after Ben Harlow retired. He'd also inherited Harlow's unsolved cases, including Ray Tucker's file, which still sat in the basement storage room gathering dust. Ridley stood on the shore, hands on his hips, looking out at Gary's boat. "You sure it's a vehicle?" Gary nodded. "I've been staring at it for 40 minutes. It's a truck, I think. Maybe a car. Hard to tell with all the silt." Ridley exchanged a glance with Chen. "Call the dive team from Eugene, and get someone from Fish and Wildlife out here. If we're pulling something out of the reservoir, I want it done right." The dive team arrived late that afternoon. 2 divers, both with the Eugene Police Department, suited up and entered the water. The visibility was poor, the silt churned up by their fins, but they worked methodically, running their hands over the submerged vehicle, clearing away mud and debris. After 20 minutes, one of the divers surfaced. He removed his regulator and called out to Ridley. "It's a truck, green Ford, I think. License plates still attached, but I can't read it. Too much rust." Single quotes, Ridley felt something tighten his chest. A green Ford truck. He'd read that detail in a file years ago. He turned to Chen. "Get me the Tucker case file." Now, Chen drove back to the station, moving fast. Ridley stayed on the shore, watching the divers work. A crowd had begun to gather, locals who'd heard something was happening at the reservoir, curiosity drawing them like moths to light. Rosie from the diner was there, her arms crossed, her face pale. Dale Pittman stood near the back, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, saying nothing. By the time Chen returned with the file, the sun was starting to descend. Ridley flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the old reports, the witness statements, the inventory of Ray Tucker's belongings, their vehicle description, 1978, Ford F-150. Green Oregon plate number HJK, 429. Ridley called down to the divers. "Can you get the plate number?" They went back under. 5 minutes later, they surfaced again. One of them held up a waterproof slate with numbers scrawled on it. HJK 429. The crowd went silent. It was Ray Tucker's truck. The recovery operation took 2 days. A crane was brought in from Eugene, its massive arm extending over the water. Heavy chains were attached to the submerged truck, and slowly, inch by inch, it was lifted from the mud. Water poured from the cab. Silt slid off the hood. The green paint was barely visible beneath layers of rust and algae. When the truck finally broke the surface, completely free of the water, people gasped. The windshield was shattered. The driver's side door was dented. And inside, visible through the cracked glass, was the unmistakable shape of human remains. Ridley felt the world tilt slightly. 18 years. Ray Tucker had been missing for 18 years. And all that time, he'd been right here, less than 3 miles from town, resting at the bottom of the reservoir. The truck was placed on a flatbed trailer and covered with a tarp. The medical examiner from Eugene arrived that evening, a quiet woman named Dr. Sarah Gaines. She examined the remains briefly, enough to confirm what everyone already knew. Male, adult. I'll need to do a full autopsy to confirm identity, but based on the dental records you provided, I'd say there's a strong likelihood this is Raymond Tucker. Ridley nodded. His throat felt tight. How long do you need? A few days, maybe a week. The remains are in poor condition. 18 years, underwater. She trailed off, shaking her head. I'll do my best. The news spread through Timber Falls like wildfire. Ray Tucker had been found. After nearly 2 decades, the question that had haunted the town finally had an answer. But not the answer anyone expected. Ray Tucker hadn't vanished into the forest. He'd driven into the reservoir. His truck had gone off County Road 12, the old logging road that ran along the western ridge before it was closed in the early 90s. The road had been dangerous even back then, narrow and winding, with a steep drop-off that led straight to the water. It looked like an accident, a terrible, tragic accident. Ray had somehow missed a turn, driven through the guardrail, and plunged into the reservoir. The truck had sunk quickly, disappearing beneath the surface before anyone could see, and for 18 years it had remained there, hidden in the deep water, forgotten. But something didn't add up. Ridley stood in his office late that night, Ray Tucker's file spread across his desk. He read through the old reports again, his eyes tired, his mind racing. Ray had disappeared from the logging site on County Road 9. His truck had been found parked there, keys in the ignition, wallet on the dashboard. Everyone had assumed Ray had walked into the forest. The boot prints near the ravine had confirmed that. But now Ray's truck had been found in the reservoir, miles away from the logging site, with Ray's body inside. How was that possible? Ridley called Dale Pittman the next morning. Dale sounded old on the phone, his voice hoarse and uncertain. He agreed to come to the station. They sat across from each other in Ridley's office, the file between them like evidence at a trial. "You told Sheriff Harlow that Ray's truck was at the logging site," Ridley said. "You said it was parked near the foreman's trailer. Keys in the ignition, wallet on the dash." Dale nodded slowly. "That's right. Are you sure?" Dale's face darkened. "I stood next to it. I remember it clearly." "Why are you asking?" "Because we just pulled Ray's truck out of the reservoir," Ridley said, "with Ray inside, which means the truck at the logging site wasn't Ray's." Dale stared at him. "That's impossible." "I know." Silence filled the room. Outside, the town moved through its routines, oblivious to the contradiction that was unraveling everything they thought they knew. "Could you have been mistaken?" Ridley asked gently. "Could it have been a different truck?" Dale shook his head. "It was green, a Ford, same as Ray's, and the wallet. I saw his license, his photo. It was Ray's wallet." Ridley leaned back in his chair. Then someone planted it. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Someone had staged Ray Tucker's disappearance. Someone had parked a truck that looked like Ray's at the logging site, placed his wallet on the dashboard, and created the impression that Ray had walked into the forest. Meanwhile, Ray's actual truck, with Ray inside, had been driven into the reservoir and left to sink. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. The realization hit Timber Falls like a second shockwave. The mystery hadn't been solved. It had deepened. Ray Tucker was dead, yes, but now there were new questions. Who had killed him? Why? And how had they managed to deceive an entire town for 18 years? Dr. Gaines completed her autopsy 4 days later. She called Ridley with the results. Positive ID, based on dental record. It's Raymond Tucker. Cause of death is drowning, but there's evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Significant injury. It would have rendered him unconscious, possibly killed him outright before the truck entered the water. So he was already dead when the truck went in, or unconscious. Either way, he didn't drive himself into that reservoir. Someone else was behind the wheel. Ridley thanked her and hung up. He sat in his office, staring at the wall. Blunt force trauma. Ray had been hit from behind, knocked out, then placed in his truck and driven into the water. It was cold, methodical, the kind of killing that required planning. Ridley reopened the case officially, upgrading it from a missing person investigation to a homicide. He brought in state investigators, forensic specialists, anyone who could help piece together what had happened on July 14, 1985. But the trail was 18 years cold. Memories had faded. Witnesses had died or moved away. Evidence had been lost or destroyed. The truck, despite being recovered, yielded almost nothing useful. Any fingerprints or trace evidence had been washed away by years of submersion. Still, Ridley kept digging. He reviewed the original case file line by line. He re-interviewed everyone who'd been at the logging site that day. He examined old maps of the area, tracing the route between County Road 9 and County Road 12, looking for connections. And slowly, piece by piece, a pattern began to emerge. On the day Ray disappeared, there had been another vehicle at the logging site. A witness mentioned it in passing during the original investigation, but it hadn't seemed important at the time. A blue sedan, parked near the equipment trailer. No one knew who it belonged to. It had been gone by the time the search started. Ridley found a witness, a man named Carl Jensen, now living in Salem. Carl remembered the sedan clearly. "I thought it was weird," Carl said over the phone. "We didn't get a lot of visitors at the site. just crew and management. But that car was just sitting there. I remember thinking someone must have broken down and walked into town for help. Did you see anyone near the car? Ridley asked. No, but I wasn't paying much attention. We were working. Ridley asked if Carl could describe the car in more detail. Carl thought for a moment. Blue, four-door, maybe a Chevy. Had a dent in the rear bumper. I remember that because I almost backed into it with the skidder. It wasn't much, but it was something. Ridley put out a request to surrounding counties, asking if anyone remembered a blue sedan connected to the Tucker case. He contacted the Department of Motor Vehicles, requesting registration records from 1985 for blue Chevrolet sedans in Lincoln County. The search was painstaking, slow, but Ridley was patient. He'd waited 18 years for this case to break open. He could wait a little longer. 3 weeks later, he got a call from the DMV. They'd found a match. A 1982 Chevrolet Malibu, blue, registered to a resident of Timber Falls in 1985. The owner's name was printed at the top of the registration form. Ridley stared at it, his pulse quickening. He knew that name. Everyone in Timber Falls knew that name. The name on the registration form was Walter Eugene Brennan. Ridley sat at his desk, staring at the faded DMV document, his mind churning through memories and implications. Walter Brennan. He'd known Walter. Everyone in Timber Falls had known Walter. Walter had owned the hardware store on Main Street for 30 years. He'd been a fixture in town, the kind of man who knew everyone's name, who remembered what sized nails you'd bought last time, who sponsored the Little League team every summer. He'd been quiet, dependable, unremarkable, the sort of person who blended into the background of small-town life so completely that you barely noticed he was there. Walter Brennan had died in 1997, 6 years ago. Heart attack. He was 68. There'd been a funeral at the Methodist Church, well attended, filled with people who spoke warmly about his generosity and his steady presence. He was buried in the Hilltop Cemetery, 3 rows over from where Sheriff Ben Harlow would be laid to rest a year later. Ridley picked up the phone and called Deputy Chen. I need you to pull everything we have on Walter Brennan. Property records, business licenses, tax filings, and I need you to find out if he had any connection to Ray Tucker. Friends, business dealings, anything. Chen paused. Walter Brennan, from the hardware store. That's the one. Sheriff, Walter's been dead for 6 years. I know. Just do it. Ridley hung up and returned his attention to the registration form. The blue Chevrolet Malibu had been registered to Walter Brennan from 1981 to 1989. When it was sold to a dealer in Eugene, Ridley made a note to track down the sale records, see if there was any indication of damage or unusual wear when Walter had gotten rid of it. But more importantly, he needed to understand why Walter's car had been at the logging site on the day Ray Tucker disappeared. The connection between Walter and Ray wasn't immediately obvious. They'd lived in the same small town, shopped at the same stores, attended the same community events, but that didn't mean they'd been close. Ray had worked in the logging camps. Walter had run a hardware store. Their lives would have intersected occasionally. Ray probably bought supplies from Walter's store, but there was no indication they'd been friends or enemies. So why had Walter's car been at the logging site? Ridley spent the next 2 days pulling together every piece of information he could find about Walter Brennan. Property records showed that Walter had owned the hardware store building and a small house on Maple Street. He'd never married, no children. He'd lived alone, kept to himself outside of work, attended church on Sundays. Tax filings showed steady but modest income. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. But then Chen found something. Sheriff, you need to see this. Single quotes. Chen spread a series of documents across Ridley's desk. Bank statements from 1985, subpoenaed as part of the reopened investigation into Ray Tucker's death. Look at the dates, Chen said, pointing. Ridley scanned the statements. Most transactions were routine checks written to suppliers, deposits from the store's daily earnings. But there was one entry that stood out. July 16, 1985, 2 days after Ray Tucker disappeared. A cash withdrawal of $5,000. $5,000 in 1985 was significant money, especially for a small-town hardware store owner. Could be anything, Ridley said, but his voice lacked conviction. Business expense, emergency repair, personal loan. Chen shook his head. I checked his tax returns from that year. No deduction for a business expense that large, no loan application on file. And look at this. He pointed to another entry, dated July 30th, 1985. Another cash withdrawal, $3,000, $8,000 in cash, withdrawn over 2 weeks. Right after Ray Tucker vanished, Ridley felt the pieces beginning to align. He was paying someone, or running, Chen suggested. But Walter hadn't run. He'd stayed in Timber Falls, continued operating his store, lived his life as if nothing had happened. If he'd been fleeing, why stay? If he'd been afraid, why not disappear? Unless he'd been confident he wouldn't get caught. Ridley leaned back in his chair, thinking. Walter had been smart, careful. He'd staged the scene at the logging site to make it look like Ray had walked into the forest. He'd left Ray's wallet, creating a false trail. And then he'd driven Ray's truck, with Ray's body inside, to County Road 12, and sent it into the reservoir. But why? That was the question Ridley couldn't answer. What had Ray Tucker done to Walter Brennan that warranted murder? He needed more. He needed a motive. He needed proof. Ridley started with Walter's house. It had been sold in 1998, a year after Walter's death, to a family that still lived there. Ridley obtained a warrant and explained the situation to the current owners, a couple in their 50s named the Holloways. They were cooperative, if bewildered. "We bought the place as is," Mrs. Holloway said. "Most of Walter's things were already gone. His estate sale was before we moved in." Ridley and Chen searched the house methodically. They checked the attic, the basement, the crawl spaces. They pulled up loose floorboards. They examined the walls for hidden compartments. Hours passed. They found nothing. Ridley was about to give up when Chen called from the garage. "Sheriff, you need to see this." The garage was detached from the house, a small wooden structure with a roll-up door and a concrete floor stained with decades of oil and grime. Chen was standing near the back wall, where a workbench was bolted to the studs. "I was checking behind the bench," Chen explained. "There's a loose panel." He pulled the panel away, revealing a hollow space in the wall. Inside was a metal toolbox, rusted at the edges, but still intact. Ridley opened it carefully. Inside were papers, lots of papers, old letters, receipts, handwritten notes, and at the bottom, a small leather journal. Ridley lifted the journal out with gloved hands. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, precise. Walter's handwriting. And the first entry was dated May 3, 1985, 2 months before Ray Tucker disappeared. Ridley began to read. The journal wasn't a daily diary. The entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks apart, but the content was revealing. Walter wrote about the hardware store, about money troubles, about suppliers raising prices and customers buying less. He wrote about feeling invisible, about spending his entire life in a town that barely noticed he existed. And he wrote about Ray Tucker. June 12, 1985. Saw Ray Tucker at the diner today. He didn't recognize me. I sold him a chainsaw last month, and he looked right through me like I was a ghost. People like Ray think they're better than the rest of us. They think because they work the woods, because they have dirt under their nails, they're more real, more honest, but they're just as small as everyone else. Ridley turned the page. The entries became darker, more bitter. June 28, 1985. Ray Tucker owes me money. $300 for equipment he bought on credit. He promised to pay last week. Still nothing. I saw him at the Legion Hall, buying drinks for his crew. He has money for beer, but not for his debts. Men like him take what they want, and leave the rest of us to pick up the piece. Ridley's pulse quickened. A debt. That was a motive. Not a strong one, perhaps, but in the hands of someone resentful, someone angry, it could be enough. He continued reading. July 10, 1985. I confronted Ray today. Asked him about the money. He laughed. Said he'd pay when he got around to it. Laughed in my face like I was nothing. Like my time, my business, didn't matter. I've spent 30 years in this town, building something, contributing. And men like Ray treat me like I'm invisible. The entries stopped for a few days. Then, on July 15, 1985, one day after Ray disappeared, there was a final entry. July 15, 1985, it's done. I didn't plan for it to go this way, but he left me no choice. He came to the store yesterday morning, before I opened, demanded I give him more credit, said everyone in town knew I had money, that I could afford to wait. He was angry, aggressive. He grabbed my arm. We fought. I don't remember exactly what happened. There was a wrench on the counter. The next thing I knew, he was on the floor, bleeding. I panicked. I couldn't let anyone find him there. I couldn't let anyone know. So I put him in his truck and drove. County Road 12 was empty. No witnesses. The truck went into the water clean. I went back to the logging site and left his wallet. Made it look like he walked away. No one will ever know. Ray Tucker vanished, and the world won't miss him. Ridley closed the journal slowly. His hands were shaking. It was a confession, written in Walter Brennan's own hand, a complete account of Ray Tucker's murder. But Walter was dead. There would be no arrest, no trial, no justice in the traditional sense. The truth had been hidden for 18 years, and the man responsible had died, believing he'd gotten away with it. Ridley sat in his office that night, the journal on his desk, and felt the weight of it all. Ray Tucker had died over a $300 debt and a moment of anger. His body had rested at the bottom of the reservoir for nearly 2 decades, while his killer sold hammers and nails on Main Street, smiled at customers, sponsored Little League games. Walter Brennan had lived with his secret for 12 years after Ray's death. He'd gone to his grave with it. If the drought hadn't lowered the reservoir, if Gary Breslin hadn't been fishing that morning, the truth would still be buried. But it wasn't. The silence had finally broken. Ridley called Helen Tucker in Portland. She was 59 now, remarried, living a life far removed from Timber Falls. When Ridley told her what they'd found, she didn't speak for a long time. Over $300, she said finally. Her voice was hollow. Ray died over $300. I'm sorry, Ridley said, because there was nothing else to say. Helen hung up. Ridley sat in the silence of his office, staring at the journal, at the neat handwriting that documented a murder. The story broke the next day. News crews descended on Timber Falls, drawn by the sensational details, the unsolved disappearance, the truck in the reservoir, the confession in the wall. Reporters interviewed townspeople, asking them about Ray Tucker and Walter Brennan, trying to understand how something like this could happen in a small town where everyone knew everyone. But the people of Timber Falls had no answers. They'd lived alongside a killer for years and never suspected. They'd mourned Ray Tucker's disappearance and bought their supplies from the man who'd killed him. The realization was crushing. At Rosie's diner, the photo of the logging crew still hung on the wall. Ray Tucker stood in the center, smiling his quiet smile. Rosie took the photo down and stored it in a box in the back room. She couldn't bear to look at it anymore. Dale Pittman gave one interview to a reporter from the Portland Tribune. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. We thought Ray walked into the woods. We thought maybe he fell, or got lost, or just left. We never imagined someone had killed him. Walter Brennan seemed like a good man, quiet, harmless. Shows you can't ever really know people. The reporter asked if Dale felt closure, now that the truth was known. Dale thought about that for a long time. No, he said finally. Ray's still gone. Walter's still dead. The truth doesn't bring anyone back. It just makes the past heavier. The investigation officially closed in September 2003. Sheriff Ridley held a press conference, standing in front of the station, reading from a prepared statement. After an exhaustive investigation, we have determined that Raymond Lowell Tucker was killed on July 14, 1985, by Walter Eugene Brennan. The motive was a financial dispute. Mr. Brennan concealed the crime by staging Mr. Tucker's disappearance and disposing of his body in the Timber Falls Reservoir. Mr. Brennan died in 1997. This case is now closed. Questions came from the reporters. Ridley answered them mechanically. Yes, the journal was authentic. Yes, it had been verified by handwriting experts. No, there were no other suspects. No, there were no accomplices. The press conference ended. The reporters left, and Timber Falls was alone again with its ghost. In the weeks that followed, people tried to return to their routine. But something had changed. The town felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the revelation had shrunk it. Conversations at the diner were quieter. Eye contact was harder to maintain. Trust, once implicit, now felt fragile. Walter Brennan's grave in the Hilltop Cemetery became a point of controversy. Some wanted it removed, relocated to another cemetery, as if proximity to his headstone was contamination. Others argued that the dead should remain undisturbed, that Walter had faced whatever judgment awaited him beyond this life. In the end, the grave remained, but someone spray-painted the word murderer across the headstone in red paint. The Cemetery Association cleaned it off, but the paint seeped into the porous granite, leaving a faint shadow that never quite disappeared. Ray Tucker's remains were cremated. Helen scattered his ashes in the Cascade foothills, in a meadow where the wildflowers bloomed in summer. She didn't tell anyone where. She wanted Ray to have peace, away from the town that had failed to protect him, away from the questions and the cameras and the endless retelling of his death. She never returned to Timber Falls after that. She'd said her goodbye. That was enough. The reservoir returned to its normal levels the following spring. The rains came in November, heavy and persistent, filling the valley with fresh water. The mudflats disappeared. The skeletal trees were submerged again. The place where Ray Tucker's truck had rested for 18 years was once more hidden beneath the surface, as if the water wanted to erase the memory of what it had held. But the people of Timber Falls couldn't erase their memories. They carried the story with them, a weight that never quite lifted. Parents told their children about Ray Tucker and Walter Brennan, turning it into a cautionary tale about anger and secrets and the cost of violence. The hardware store building changed hands twice before being converted into an antique shop, but it never quite thrived. Customers felt uneasy there, as if the walls still held echoes of what had happened. By 2010, it stood empty, the windows dusty, the for-lease sign fading in the sun. Ray Tucker's house, abandoned and overgrown, was finally demolished in 2008. The lot remained empty, a square of bare earth where nothing grew. Some said the ground was cursed. Others said it was just poor soil. Either way, no one wanted to build there. Timber Falls continued its slow decline. The population dropped below 300. The schools consolidated with neighboring districts. The post office closed, forcing residents to drive to the next town for their mail. The diner held on, but barely, serving a handful of regulars who ate in silence and left too much coffee in their cups. And every summer, when the reservoir sparkled in the sunlight and families came to fish and swim, people in Timber Falls remembered what lay beneath the surface. Not just silt and stones and submerged trees, but the memory of violence. The echo of a secret kept for 18 years. Sheriff Tom Ridley retired in 2012, 27 years after Ray Tucker disappeared. He'd solved the case, found the truth, brought closure to a mystery that had haunted the town for nearly 2 decades. But he didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired. On his last day, he drove out to the reservoir. He stood on the shore, looking at the water, thinking about everything that had been hidden there. The truck, the body, the truth. And he thought about Walter Brennan, who'd killed a man over a debt and lived with it for 12 years, who'd stood behind the counter of his hardware store, smiling at customers, while Ray Tucker's body rested at the bottom of the reservoir, who'd died believing he'd gotten away with it. In the end, Walter had been right. He had gotten away with it. He'd died peacefully, mourned by a town that never knew what he'd done. The truth had come out, yes, but only after Walter was beyond its reach. There was no justice in that, no resolution. Just the cold, hard fact that sometimes people do terrible things and face no consequences, that sometimes the guilty die in their sleep, while the innocent rests in unmarked graves. Ridley got back in his car and drove home. He never returned to the reservoir. 20 years after the truth came out, Timber Falls is barely recognizable. The population hovers just below 200. Main Street has more empty storefronts than occupied ones. The diner closed in 2018, Rosie having finally retired at 83, too tired to keep serving meatloaf to ghosts. The building was purchased by an investor from California who planned to turn it into a brewery, but the financing fell through. Now it sits dark, the windows covered with plywood, the faded sign still hanging above the door. The gas station is now a self-serve operation, unmanned, just pumps and a credit card reader. The churches have merged congregations, sharing a pastor who drives in from 2 towns over. The school closed entirely in 2015. The last 23 students bused to a consolidated district 40 minutes away. Timber Falls is dying, not dramatically, not with violence or catastrophe, just slowly fading, the way small towns do when the reasons for their existence disappear. The timber industry is gone. The jobs are gone. The young people leave and never come back. But the memory remains. On certain websites, in certain forums, where people discuss unsolved mysteries and true crime, the story of Ray Tucker and Walter Brennan still circulates. Amateur detectives debate the details. Podcasters recount the events, their voices dramatic and breathless. YouTube documentaries splice together old news footage and reenactments, adding ominous music and speculative narration. The story has become entertainment, a puzzle to solve, a mystery to dissect. The human cost, the grief, the betrayal, the years of not knowing, get smoothed over in the retelling, reduced to plot points and narrative beats. But for the people who lived through it, who knew Ray and Walter, who spent 18 years carrying the question of what happened, the story is not entertainment. It's a scar. Dale Pittman died in 2016. He was 86. His obituary in the Lincoln County Gazette mentioned his 40 years in the logging industry, his service in the Army during the Korean War, his dedication to his family. It did not mention Ray Tucker. It did not mention that July day in 1985 when Dale had radioed for help and started a search. That would last nearly 2 decades. But at Dale's funeral, held in the Methodist Church with maybe 30 people in attendance, his daughter spoke. She was in her 50s, a schoolteacher from Salem, who'd grown up in Timber Falls and left as soon as she could. My father carried a lot of weight, she said, her voice steady but quiet. He didn't talk about it much, but I knew. The disappearance of Ray Tucker haunted him his entire life. When they found Ray's truck in the reservoir, when they learned the truth, I thought maybe Dad would feel some relief, but he didn't. He just seemed sadder. He said once that knowing what happened didn't change anything. Ray was still gone, and all those years of searching, of wondering, couldn't be given back. She paused, looking out at the sparse congregation. I think my father felt like he'd failed somehow, like if he'd just looked harder, or thought differently, or asked the right questions, maybe Ray would have been found sooner. I told him it wasn't his fault, that he'd done everything he could, but I don't think he ever believed that. The church was silent. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Someone coughed, and in that moment, the full weight of what Ray Tucker's death had cost was visible, not just the life lost, but the guilt carried by those left behind, the what-ifs that never quite let go. Helen Tucker, Helen Morrison now, after her second marriage, still lives in Portland. She's 79, a retired bank manager, a grandmother of 4. Her grandchildren know she was married before, that her first husband disappeared, but they don't know the details. She's never told them. Some stories are too heavy to pass down. She hasn't been back to Timber Falls since she scattered Ray's ashes in 2003. She has no desire to return. The town holds nothing for her now but pain. But sometimes, late at night, when her husband is asleep and the house is quiet, Helen thinks about Ray. Not the way he died. She's made peace with that, as much as anyone can make peace with senseless violence. She thinks about the way he lived, the small moments, the morning coffee, the careful way he tied his boots, the rare smile that made him look younger than his years. She thinks about the life they might have had if things had been different, if Walter Brennan had been a more patient man, if Ray had paid his debt on time, if the two of them had never crossed paths that July morning in 1985. But things weren't different, and thinking about what might have been is just another kind of haunting. The reservoir still stands, its water levels rising and falling with the season. Families still come in summer to fish and swim, unaware of what was once submerged beneath their boats. The drought of 2003 has not repeated. The water remains high, dark, impenetrable, but locals don't swim there anymore. Even now, 20 years after Ray's truck was pulled from the depths, people in Timber Falls avoid the reservoir. They tell their children it's dangerous, that the currents are unpredictable, that it's better to swim in the river or drive to the lake 2 towns over. They don't say it's because a man died there. They don't say it's because the water held a secret for 18 years, silent and patient, waiting for the moment of revelation. They don't have to. Their children understand. Fear doesn't always need words. The cemetery on the hill overlooks Timber Falls, its headstones standing in neat rows among the Douglas firs. Walter Brennan's grave is still there, the word murderer still faintly visible on the granite, despite multiple cleaning. No one tends it. No one leaves flowers. It simply exists, marking the place where a killer was laid to rest. 3 rows over, where Sheriff Ben Harlow's headstone stands, someone occasionally leaves a small American flag on Veterans Day. Harlow served in World War II before becoming sheriff. He was a good man, people say. He did his best. But his best wasn't enough to solve the Ray Tucker case. That failure followed him to the grave, a weight he carried through retirement and into death. When Harlow died in 1996, 7 years before the truth came out, he died not knowing what had happened to Ray Tucker. He died with the question unanswered. Sometimes closure comes too late. The house where Ray Tucker lived was torn down in 2008, but the empty lot remains. Grass grows there now, wild and unkempt, punctuated by dandelions and thistle. The foundation is still visible, a rectangle of cracked concrete slowly being reclaimed by the earth. Teenagers sometimes gather there at night, sitting on the old foundation, passing around cheap beer and cigarettes, daring each other to stay until midnight. They tell stories about Ray Tucker, embellishing the details, turning tragedy into legend. They say his ghost walks the woods at night. They say you can hear his truck starting up near the reservoir, even though the truck was crushed and scrapped years ago. They say if you stand on the empty lot and call his name 3 times, he'll appear. None of it is true. But truth and legend have always had an uneasy relationship in places like Timber Falls. The hardware store building, converted briefly into an antique shop and then abandoned, burned down in 2019. The fire started in the middle of the night. Cause unknown. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the structure was fully engulfed. Flames reaching into the dark sky. Sparks drifting like fireflies. No one was hurt. The building was empty. But people stood in the street and watched it burn with a strange sense of relief, as if the fire was purging something necessary, as if brick and timber could hold guilt, and flames could set it free. When the ashes cooled, the lot was cleared. The foundation was demolished. Nothing was rebuilt. Now, it's just another empty space in a town full of empty spaces. Sheriff Tom Ridley is 82 now, living in a retirement community in Eugene. He has grandchildren who visit on weekends. He has hobbies, woodworking, crossword puzzles, watching baseball on television. He has a life that looks peaceful from the outside. But he still thinks about Ray Tucker. Not every day, not even every week, but sometimes, when he's lying in bed waiting for sleep to come, his mind drifts back to that summer in 2003, to the truck being lifted from the reservoir, water pouring from the cab, to Walter Brennan's journal, the neat handwriting documenting a murder, to the realization that the answer had been hidden in plain sight for 18 years. Ridley had solved the case. He'd found the truth. He'd given Ray Tucker's family closure, such as it was, but the victory felt hollow. Justice hadn't been served. Walter Brennan had died peacefully, surrounded by people who thought he was a good man. Ray Tucker had died violently, alone, his body hidden at the bottom of a reservoir. There was no balance in that, no fairness. Just the cold reality that sometimes bad things happen and no one pays the price. Ridley learned something from the Ray Tucker case, something that stayed with him through retirement and into old age. That truth, when it finally emerges, doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it just brings more questions. Sometimes it just makes the weight heavier. In Timber Falls, the handful of people who remain have learned to live with their history. They don't talk about Ray Tucker much anymore. The tourists who occasionally pass through, drawn by the true crime podcasts and YouTube videos, are met with polite indifference. The locals will answer questions if pressed, but they don't volunteer information. They've learned that their pain is not entertainment, and they guard it accordingly. The story of Ray Tucker has become part of the landscape now, woven into the fabric of the town as deeply as the Douglas firs and the winding roads. It's in the empty lots and the closed businesses. It's in the cemetery on the hill. It's in the reservoir that reflects the sky like a mirror, beautiful and still, hiding its secrets beneath the surface. On July 14th each year, the anniversary of Ray's disappearance, someone places flowers at the edge of the reservoir. No one knows who. The flowers are always simple, daisies or wildflowers picked from the roadside, tied with twine. They're never elaborate, never showy, just a quiet acknowledgement that something terrible happened here and that someone remembers. The flowers usually last a few days before the wind scatters them, or the rain washes them away. Then they're gone, leaving no trace, as if they were never there at all. Just like Ray Tucker. The forest has reclaimed the logging roads where Ray worked. County Road 9, where his boot prints were found near the ravine, is overgrown now, barely passable. The trees have grown back thick and tall, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the sun. If you walked there now, you wouldn't know anything had ever happened. Nature has a way of erasing human tragedy, of smoothing over the scars until there's nothing left but silence. But the silence itself is a kind of memory. It speaks of absence, of things lost and never recovered, of questions asked and eventually answered, but never in a way that brings comfort. In the end, the story of Ray Tucker is not about solving a mystery. It's about the cost of violence and the weight of secrets. It's about how one moment of anger can ripple forward through decades, touching lives and changing futures. It's about how small towns carry their tragedies like stones in their pocket, heavy and constant, worn smooth by years of handling. Ray Tucker deserved better than the death he received. He deserved better than 18 years at the bottom of a reservoir. He deserved better than a killer who went unpunished, who lived and died in peace, while Ray's family wondered and grieved. But deserving and getting have never been the same thing. What remains now is just the memory, the story, the cautionary tale told in quiet voices over coffee, passed down from one generation to the next, kept alive, not out of morbid fascination, but out of obligation. Because to forget would be worse. To let Ray Tucker fade completely from memory would be a second death, and no one deserves to die twice. So the story persists, imperfect, incomplete, unsatisfying in its resolution, but real, achingly, devastatingly real. And Timber Falls, what's left of it, carries that reality forward into an uncertain future. The town may disappear entirely someday. The buildings may all collapse. The roads may all fade back into forest. But somewhere, in some archive or database, the record will remain. Ray Tucker, Walter Brennan. July 14, 1985. A man disappeared. A town searched. The truth stayed hidden for 18 years. And when it finally emerged, it changed nothing and everything at once. That's the nature of cold cases. They're never really solved. They're just reclassified, moved from one box to another. The questions remain, even when the answers are found. How does a man vanish in a town where everyone knows everyone? How does a killer live among his neighbors, smiling and helpful, carrying his secret like a second skin? How does a community heal from betrayal when the betrayer is beyond reach? There are no satisfying answers, just the silence, the weight, the endless echo of what was lost. And in that silence, if you listen carefully, you can hear something. Not a voice, not a confession. Just the quiet acknowledgement of human fragility. The recognition that we are all capable of violence, and we are all vulnerable to it. That the line between victim and perpetrator is sometimes just a matter of timing and circumstance. Ray Tucker crossed paths with Walter Brennan on a July morning in 1985. One man was frustrated and demanding. The other was resentful and armed. A wrench was within reach. A moment of anger became a lifetime of consequences. That's the story. That's the truth. Cold, hard, unforgiving, and it haunts Timber Falls still. Not with ghosts or supernatural whispers, not with curses or omens, but with something far more terrifying. The knowledge that ordinary people in ordinary places are capable of extraordinary harm. That evil doesn't always announce itself. That sometimes it wears a familiar face, and speaks in a friendly voice, and sells you nails at the hardware store. The forest keeps its secrets. The water reflects the sky. The empty lots grow weeds and wildflowers. And somewhere in the space between memory and forgetting, Ray Tucker rests, not at peace. You don't find peace when you die violently over a $300 debt, but at rest, finally known, finally found. The question has been answered. The mystery has been solved, but the silence remains, heavy, persistent, eternal. And Timber Falls carries it forward, one quiet day at a time, until there's nothing left but the forest and the wind and the stories we tell ourselves about what happened in the summer of 1985. Sometimes truth survives only in the memories of those who still wait, and sometimes the waiting never really ends.